Deep in the Hürtgen Forest, a dense and unforgiving stretch of woodland along the German-Belgian border, a small group of American soldiers found themselves in the midst of a desperate battle. It was November 1944, and the Allies were pushing deep into German territory, but the Hürtgen Forest stood as a formidable obstacle, its narrow roads and dense foliage making it a perfect haven for German troops. Among the American forces was a tiny team of 19 men from the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, who had been tasked with holding a strategic road junction deep in the forest. The team, led by Lieutenant Colonel John T. Corley, had been ordered to defend the junction at all costs, as it provided a crucial supply route for the advancing Allied forces. As the team dug in, they knew they were in for a tough fight. The Germans had been retreating through the forest for weeks, but they had not given up yet. In fact, they had been reinforcing their positions, pouring in troops and artillery to hold back the Allied advance. The American team was vastly outnumbered, with estimates suggesting that over 3,000 German troops were massing in the surrounding woods. But Corley and his men were determined to hold their ground, knowing that the road junction was the key to the entire Allied operation. The battle began on a chilly autumn morning, as the Germans launched a massive artillery barrage against the American position. The team huddled in their foxholes, waiting for the onslaught to pass, but it seemed to go on forever. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air was filled with the scream of incoming shells. When the barrage finally lifted, the Germans launched a wave of infantry attacks, pouring out of the trees in a seemingly endless tide of grey uniforms. The American team held their fire, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when the Germans were just a few yards away, their rifles and machine guns blazing as they tried to overwhelm the American position. Corley gave the order to open fire, and the team unleashed a withering barrage of their own, cutting down the German troops in rows. But the attackers just kept coming, wave after wave of them, and the American team began to take casualties. Corley's men were dropping all around him, but he refused to give up, rallying his troops and urging them to hold their ground. As the day wore on, the battle showed no signs of letting up. The Americans were running low on ammunition, and their position was starting to look precarious. But Corley had a plan. He knew that the Germans were trying to outflank them, to get around their position and cut them off from the rest of the Allied forces. So he ordered his men to fall back to a new position, one that would give them a better chance of defending themselves. It was a risky move, but it paid off. The Germans followed them, but they were slower to adapt, and the American team was able to catch their breath and regroup. As night began to fall, the battle finally started to die down. The Germans had taken heavy casualties, and they were starting to lose heart. Corley and his men, on the other hand, were exhausted but triumphant. They had held their ground, despite being vastly outnumbered, and they had given the Allies a crucial toehold in the Hürtgen Forest. As they settled in for the night, they knew that they had accomplished something special. They had changed the course of the battle, and they had paved the way for the Allied victory. The 19 men who had held back 3,000 Germans had become heroes, their bravery and determination in the face of overwhelming odds inspiring their comrades and cementing their place in history. The battle at Hürtgen was just one of many fierce and brutal engagements that took place during the Allied advance into Germany. But it was a turning point, a moment when the tide of the war began to shift decisively in favor of the Allies. And for Corley and his men, it was a moment of triumph, a testament to their courage and their unwavering commitment to their mission. They had been asked to hold a strategic road junction, and they had done just that, against all odds. As the war finally began to wind down, they knew that their bravery and sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that their heroism would inspire generations to come. As the night wore on, Corley's men tried to get some rest, but they knew it would be a short-lived respite. The Germans would regroup and come at them again, and they had to be ready. Corley ordered his men to dig in deeper, to create a stronger defensive position that would give them a better chance of withstanding the next attack. The men worked tirelessly, their shovels scraping against the damp earth as they dug and fortified their new position. Meanwhile, Corley took a small team to scout out the German lines, to see if they could gather any intelligence on the enemy's plans. They moved stealthily through the darkness, trying not to make a sound as they crept closer to the German position. As they watched, they saw the Germans bringing up more troops and artillery, preparing for another massive assault. Corley knew that his men had to be ready, and he quickly made his way back to their position to prepare them for the coming battle. As he arrived, he saw that his men were exhausted, their eyes sunken from lack of sleep and their bodies battered from the day's fighting. But they were still determined, still ready to defend their position against all odds. Corley knew that he had to make a decision, and fast. He could try to hold out against the German assault, or he could try to fall back and regroup with the rest of the Allied forces. But he knew that if he fell back, the Germans would pour through the gap and cut off the Allied advance. He decided to hold out, to defend their position to the last man. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the Germans launched their attack. The artillery barrage was even more intense than the day before, the shells screaming in and exploding with deafening force. Corley's men huddled in their foxholes, waiting for the onslaught to pass, but it seemed to go on forever. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air was filled with the scream of incoming shells. When the barrage finally lifted, the Germans launched a wave of infantry attacks, pouring out of the trees in a seemingly endless tide of grey uniforms. Corley's men were ready, and they unleashed a withering barrage of their own, cutting down the German troops in rows. But the attackers just kept coming, wave after wave of them, and Corley's men began to take casualties. The American team was running low on ammunition, and their position was starting to look precarious. Corley knew that he had to do something, and fast, or risk being overrun. He called for a volunteer to make a run to the rear to try and bring up more ammunition and reinforcements. One of his men, a young private named Johnson, stepped forward, and Corley knew that he had made the right choice. Johnson was fast and agile, and he might just make it through the German lines. Corley handed him a map and a message, and told him to go. Johnson took off, sprinting through the trees as the battle raged on. He dodged and weaved, avoiding the German troops and making his way deeper into the forest. As he ran, he could hear the sound of gunfire and artillery growing fainter, and he knew that he was getting closer to the Allied lines. But he also knew that he was running out of time, and that Corley's men were counting on him to bring back the supplies they so desperately needed. Johnson pushed himself to run faster, his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted through the forest. He could see the trees thinning out up ahead, and he knew that he was getting close to the edge of the forest. Suddenly, he heard the sound of gunfire up ahead, and he knew that he was approaching the Allied lines. He burst through the trees, waving his arms and shouting to the Allied troops to hold their fire. The soldiers looked up in surprise, and then one of them recognized Johnson and shouted for him to come over. Johnson sprinted towards them, exhausted but triumphant, and handed over the message from Corley. The soldier read it quickly, and then nodded and took off, shouting for reinforcements to be sent to Corley's position. Johnson collapsed to the ground, exhausted, but he knew that he had done his job. He had made it through the German lines, and he had brought back the help that Corley's men so desperately needed. As he caught his breath, he could hear the sound of artillery and gunfire growing louder, and he knew that the battle was far from over. Corley's men were still out there, fighting for their lives, and Johnson knew that he had to get back to them. He struggled to his feet, and began to make his way back through the forest, ready to rejoin the fight and help his comrades to victory.